Hello, Guerilla History listeners. Today for you, we have an excellent episode, one that features two fantastic guests. And as a result of having some time constraints with our guests, we weren't able to give a proper introduction to them. So we are going to do that briefly now before we get into the episode itself. The guests that we have are Professor Noam Chomsky and our friend Vijay Prashad, who together wrote the forthcoming book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power, which is coming out next week from the New Press. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Pre-order now. Highly recommend everybody get that book. The book is talking about the weaknesses of the American state, as well as kind of a history of American imperialism. It's a fascinating conversation that we have, and it actually worked out in a very interesting way. We planned on them coming on together to talk simultaneously with us, but we actually had it work out so that Professor Chomsky came on first and Vijay joined us right at the end of that. And we had a little bit of a supplemental discussion with Vijay after Professor Chomsky had to leave. It's a fascinating episode. I know that you're all really going to love it. And I highly recommend that you share this episode widely, because regardless of where you stand ideologically, I think that there is a lot of really valuable information in this episode. And I highly recommend that you listen to it in its entirety from beginning to end, because you'll learn a lot. I guarantee it. So without further ado, let's turn to our episode on the withdrawal with Professor Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad.
You remember Dien Bien Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Hello and welcome to Guerilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm your host, Henry Huckamacky, joined by my co-hosts, Professor Adnan Hussain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be with you, Henry.
Absolutely. And also joined by Brett O'Shea, host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of the Red Menace podcast. Hello, Brett. How are you?
Doing great. Very excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. We have hopefully two fantastic guests. Right now, we're starting with just one, which is the inimitable Professor Noam Chomsky, who really doesn't need much of an introduction at this point. We're also hoping to be joined by Vijay Prashad, who I guess for our listeners also doesn't need much of an introduction at this point, as he's been on the show 2 or 3 times at this point. But we're going to be focusing on their new book, The Withdrawal, which hasn't come out yet at the time of recording, but we'll release this right at the time that the book is coming out. And it's a very, very interesting work. The first thing that I want to open with as we get the conversation underway is something that's really fundamental to a lot of the analysis that takes place in The Withdrawal, which is looking at case studies of Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and how the U.S. pull out of these areas has really caused a devastation for the population. One of the things that's really critical to the analysis is your analysis of the Godfather attitude. I'm wondering, Professor Chomsky, if you can introduce what the Godfather attitude is for the audience, because this will be useful going forward into the conversation.
Well, there's plenty of serious academic work in international relations theory. But in fact, there are some simple approaches which are pretty good as first approximations. One is that international relations are in many ways rather like the mafia. There's a godfather, somebody who wishes to be the godfather. He gives the orders, others obey or else they're in trouble. It's for a long period, Britain was the major dominant hegemonic power, France as well. That ended with the Second World War. The United States took over in a position of power that had no historical precedent whatsoever. Even though it's declined some since, it still remains largely true. So when the U.S. gives orders, everyone obeys, or else, whether they like it or not. Just to give a couple of examples to illustrate, take, say, the U.S. torture of Cuba for the last 60 years, ever since Cuba won independence. Almost within months, the U.S. started to try to overthrow the government. Invasions, terrorist war, crushing sanctions. The world is totally against it. If you look at the votes in the United Nations on the sanctions, most recent one was 184 to 2, or the United States and Israel. Israel has to vote with the United States. So it's basically the world against the United States. But every country adheres to them. European countries oppose, but they adhere to the sanctions. They don't want the punishment that comes with disobeying the Godfather. U.S. sanctions are third-party, what are called third-party sanctions. Even those not named or mentioned have to adhere to them. Take another case, Iran, same story. U.S. pulled out of the joint agreement on Iranian nuclear programs in violation of Security Council endorsement and in opposition to all of the other signers. European countries all opposed, strongly opposed, but they all obey. They all obey the sanctions because the Godfather is too frightening. So that's a reasonable, we give many other examples, but it's a reasonable first approximation to the way the world actually works.
So, this book covers many countries spanning from the Vietnam War up to the present day. And a lot of times when we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan and, places like even Vietnam, they'll often be framed by certain people as failures. The U.S. was defeated in, Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam. Are these ostensible failures abroad really losses for U.S. imperialism? Or is their destabilization and destruction sufficient for U.S. goals in the region?
Not really. Take Vietnam, the worst, the most grotesque crime since the Second World War. It's not just Vietnam, it's all of Indochina. The United States devastated Laos and Cambodia under Nixon. Did the United States lose the war? Well, depends how you look at it. The United States did not achieve its maximal gains. Its maximal gains were to turn all of Vietnam into a kind of like the Philippines, client state. That didn't work. Vietnamese resistance was too strong. But if you look back at the original goals of the war, which fortunately we can do, because one of the good things about the United States is it's a very free society, have a lot of access to internal documents. Even more in this case, thanks to Dan Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers. Then the government released its own version. So we have extensive documentation, rich record of why the United States went to war. It goes back to the early 50s. And the rationale for entering the war was perfectly rational imperialism. It's what Henry Kissinger called the threat of a virus that can spread contagion. Vietnam was the virus. It was embarked on a course of successful independent development. No, not Russia, not China, that was all invented, but it was moving towards independent development, might have been successful. That would have had a contagious effect. It would have affected, sometimes called the domino effect. It would have affected Thailand, then Burma, Malaysia, Indonesia, which was the big prize. Vietnam didn't matter much, but Indonesia had enormous resources and wealth. And if it went that far, it might, I'm virtually quoting internal documents now. If it went that far, Japan, at that point, the industrial technological powerhouse of Asia, would accommodate to an independent East Asia and become its technological industrial center and have the rest of the region as a research and market area. Well, that's Japan's goal during the Second World War, to create what they called a new order in Asia. And in the early 1950s, the United States was not prepared to lose the Second World War. Maybe ugly, but it's not unintelligible. So how do you deal with a virus that's going to cause contagion? You destroy the virus, you inoculate the potential victims. That means establish brutal military dictatorships in the surrounding countries, which would prevent any spread of dangerous thoughts of independent development. As for the virus, you just smash it to pieces. Well, it's pretty much what happened. In fact, it was sort of recognized by the more intelligent US planners. So towards the end of the war, late 70s, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, reflected on the war. And he said, we should have pulled out in 1965. Why? Because in 1965, first of all, the whole region was in the hands of dictators. So that problem had been solved. The last one was Indonesia, the most important, still independent. But in 1965, a US-backed military coup took place. Suharto coup killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed the main political party. Indonesia was in safe hands, or open to US investors, no more problems. So Bundy's reflection was, well, at that point, there was really not much point going on with the Vietnam War. So in that respect, the US won the war. With regard to its maximal objectives, it lost the war. So the question is where you look. You look at the other cases, it's a mixed bag. So take Afghanistan. That's one case where the US had no strategic objective. It was just vengeance and rage. In fact, that's very clear from the Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney statements. In fact, the reasons were pretty well captured by the leading figure in the Afghan anti-Taliban resistance. Highly respected Afghan Abdul Haq was later killed. But at the very beginning of the US bombing, he was interviewed and asked, why is the US bombing? He said, the US wants to show its muscle and intimidate everyone. They're killing a lot of Afghans. They're undermining our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, but they don't care. They just they're angry. They want to show their muscle. And let's kill anybody on sight. Now, the Afghan population had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And in fact, they wanted to get rid of them, in fact. They'd made efforts to get rid of them. The US rejected it. But at that point, when the US bombed, it did not even know that Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. It was suspected, but as the FBI conceded, they really didn't know. They just wanted to go in and smash things up. Bush made it very clear. Forget his exact words. He used vulgarisms, but said, I just want to go and smash something up. I'm angry. So let's kill the Afghans. Well, in fact, became very clear a couple of months into the war. Actually, even before the invasion, Afghanistan, the Taliban had offered some various means of putting up Al-Qaeda to international trial. The US didn't want to hear it. Shortly after the war, the Taliban simply surrendered. Said, okay, You take over, you get Al-Qaeda, you get whatever you want. U.S. rejected it. Rumsfeld, defense secretary, responded by saying, "We do not negotiate surrenders." George Bush repeated it. In fact, shortly after, Bush was asked in a press conference, what's the situation with Al-Qaeda? He said, "We don't care. I'm not interested in Al-Qaeda. We're going to show the world that we can be tough and brutal. Don't meddle with us or we'll kill somebody else." There was no strategic goal for Afghanistan. And that ended up with a 20-year debacle. Wrecked, destroyed Afghanistan. U.S. got nothing out of it, spent trillions of dollars. So that's one case where the U.S. didn't win the war. But almost every other case is very hard for the Godfather to lose. Overwhelming power, fighting much weaker enemies. Not easy.
It brings up an interesting point. I mean, in the book, you do talk about both this kind of Godfather-like expression of hegemony through brutal means and mechanisms, and at other points, the analysis of U.S. empire resolves around rational geopolitical or other kinds of material sorts of interests. And it seems that there is something of a tension between these. And I'm wondering if you find or feel that there is a larger or deeper logic to how this form of imperialism works in such a way that, that sometimes the destruction in the global South is somehow the point, or whether it's the military Keynesian dimension that you also discuss that makes it a dysfunctional empire, because there are certain powerful interests that will stand to gain, even if there's a larger lack of a geostrategic rationale.
Well, you're quite right. These are multiple variable events. There are many factors involved. I think that's true of anything complex, certainly international relations. So you get people who are just infantile, childish, furious, angry, the George Bush types. Or you get people like Donald Trump, who has only one idea in his head, namely me. Nothing else matters. The people around him kind of restrain him and try to move him back to serious strategic thinking, but he may be impossible. So you get things like that. But in fact, all across the board, take Kennedy. Kennedy was a reasonable person, Massachusetts, Harvard liberal. But after the Bay of Pigs, he and his whole Harvard group just went crazy. This is actually described in memoirs by people like Charles Bowles, who was in the group. So there was just hysteria, fury. How can they do this to us? How can a tiny little nothing country beat back our invasion? They went crazy. That's when they launched the terrorist war, massive sanctions, even a build-up to the terrorist war, probably leading to invasion, was one of the major factor in the missile crisis, which almost blew up the world. But they were just off. It was totally irrational. They say we were just, in fact, Kennedy himself said, people in the outside are going to think we're crazy. Well, they did, in fact. So there are factors like that. But nevertheless, there is a geostrategic region. And if you look back at Cuba again, so we do have documents, internal documents from the 60s, and State Department made clear that, as they put it, the threat of Castro is his successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. announced that it intends to dominate the hemisphere. Couldn't do it at that time. Britain was much too strong. But it was understood that Britain's power would decline, U.S. power would increase. sooner or later, the United States could dominate the hemisphere. Castro was challenging that. You don't get away with it. So despite the hysteria and irrationality, there was an underlying serious analysis, namely the Godfather theory, which does play an enormous role in world affairs. It's never described that way, but if you look at it, that's pretty much what it is. I might say that one of the most astute brief analyses of international relations goes back 250 years to Adam Smith. You read Wealth of Nations, not a high school variant of it that you learn, but what he actually wrote. I said that throughout all the ages, the masters of mankind have pursued their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. Then he was talking about England in 1776, said, in England, the masters of mankind are the merchants and manufacturers of England. And they make sure that they are the principal architects of government policy. And they make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, taken care of, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England, but particularly those subject to the savage injustice of the Europeans, referring specifically to the British in India. That's a pretty good description of world affairs in all ages.
Yeah, so when we think about the geopolitical reasoning, it often is quite clear, when we look at what interests the United States has in various interventions abroad, there are certain things that really stand out if you think beyond what you're hearing in the headlines. However, what we often hear are not geopolitically based. They're based in other sorts of justifications. And you and Vijay in the Withdrawal talk, not super extensively, but at least a little bit about different justifications for war. You talk about just war theory, you talk about the responsibility to protect, R2P, and in quite excoriating current terms, and rightly so. So I'm wondering if you would be able to, for our audience, give a little bit of that critique of these various theories of when is it time to intervene abroad, and how the United States particularly, and also using its proxies like NATO, which really is just the United States by any other name, if we're being honest with ourselves, how they use this as basically a smokescreen to hide the geopolitical reasoning behind their interventions.
Well, now we're moving into the arena of what's called American exceptionalism. Other countries do bad and ugly things, but we always have good intentions. Maybe we make mistakes. Anybody can make mistakes, but it's all done with the best of intentions. So, for example, at the end of the Vietnam War, the Indochina War, which was an utter monstrosity, as I said, the worst crime since the Second World War. Of course, at the end of the war, everyone had to write a comment about it. Most interesting is at the left end of the admissible spectrum. That's always the most interesting. So you go to Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, critic of the war, left analyst by mainstream standards. He wrote that the United States entered the war with benign intentions to do good, but we found that it was a mistake. We couldn't bring democracy to Vietnam at a cost satisfactory to ourselves. So it was a mistake. That's the left end of criticism in the mainstream. It's about on the par of Russian generals in the invasion of Afghanistan who recognized that it was a strategic error. Okay, we don't give them effusive praise for that. But that's basically the end of the spectrum here. There's two problems with American exceptionalism. One is the historical record. which shows that it's totally false. But another is it's not exceptional. Every other imperial power has pursued the same line. So when Britain was smashing India to pieces, right at the peak of the atrocities, in fact, in 1857, John Stuart Mill, a really remarkable intellectual, there are very few capable of, who worthy of shining his shoes, really outstanding person. 1857, right in the middle of the worst British atrocities, Mill wrote an article about intervention. Serious article, thoughtful guy. People teach it in law schools. He said, intervention's a bad thing, shouldn't do it, but there are exceptions. He said, one exception is Britain. Britain is not an ordinary country. It's an angelic power. It works solely for the benefit of mankind. In fact, it's so angelic that European countries can't understand us. They, as he put it, heap obloquy on us, try to find hidden motives in what we're doing, because we're so beyond them in our angelic character that they just can't understand that we're working for the benefit of mankind as we slaughter Indians, conquer more of India for more opium production, so we can force our way by gunboat into China. It's all ultra angelic. Well, that's John Stuart Mill, about as respectable and intellectual as you can find. You go to France, the intellectuals were admiring themselves for their civilizing mission. Well, the chief general in Algeria said, we must exterminate the population. Go down the list, you're going to find the same thing. If we had records from Attila the Hun, we'd probably find the same thing. I've never found an exception. So American exceptionalism is just conformity to the norm plus denial of the facts. And it's very interesting to see how this is dealt with by the more reasonable and serious of international relations scholars. So take Hans Morgenthau, very decent person, very good scholar, one of the early critics of the Vietnam War. He was the founder of what's called the realist movement, the dominant movement in IR theory, hard-headed, no sentimentality, realism. He was the founder of it. Well, he wrote an interesting book called The Purpose of America. Other countries don't have purposes, but America has purposes. What's the purpose of America? To bring justice and freedom, to all good things, to the Americans and to the world. But he's a serious scholar. So he ran through the record. He said, if you look at the record, you can see that the United States did not live up to its purpose. In case after case, it acted contrary to its purpose. And then he made an interesting comment. He said to question the American purpose on grounds of history is an error. It's to confuse the abuse of history with history itself. The abuse of history is what happened. History itself is the transcendent purpose as reflected in our minds. And he said, this is like the error of atheism, which questions the glory of God on this because there's evil in the world. We should not fall into that error. Well, I think he inadvertently captured it pretty well. And remember, this is the founder, the guru of the hard-headed, no-nonsense realist school. Well, you learn things from that. So the American exceptionalism is the norm, and it's completely refuted by history, but it changes nothing. You read article after article, press scholarship about American exceptionalism. The facts just don't matter. They're what Morgenthau called abusive history.
Well, that's interesting that you brought up the founder of realism and this realist school when it comes to American exceptionalism, which seems to be a perduring presumption in the American foreign policy sort of class. And, over the discussion in this book, you do talk about some of these different orientations that made different kinds of arguments for U.S. imperial intervention at different stages. It reminds me a little bit of that shift from, say, George H.W. Bush, who was presumably guided by the sort of realist geostrategic interests, rational foreign policy, balance of power kinds of things to ensure U.S. dominance, and the first Iraq war, and the George W. Bush policy that was guided by the neocon desire for, American hegemony for the sake of it, and all of the things that you discuss about how the goals, the very ideological goals for U.S. hegemony were apparent right after 9/11, already in these discussions by Rumsfeld. But it makes me wonder if you think there's really much of a difference ultimately between the sort of realist and the kind of neocon liberal spread democracy hegemony, and what you think about that kind of apparent conflict that sometimes is made a great deal of within internal U.S. policy debates and discussions.
Well, there's a difference, but you're quite right. It's not much of a difference. From the point of view of the victims, it's about the same, comes out the same way. So take H.W. Bush, the statesman. After the first Gulf War, he said, "We have demonstrated," his words, "that what we say goes." Godfather. Did he have to fight the first Gulf War? Absolutely not. Just take a look at what happened. Saddam Hussein was a dictator surrounded by sycophants, never heard any contrary voice. He apparently assumed that the U.S. had given him the green light to invade Kuwait. Kuwait had been robbing Iraqi oil resources, tapping into Iraqi fields. Iraq had defended the Arab world, and he thought Kuwait owed them a debt, and he should take over the oil. He very quickly realized he'd misinterpreted it. He was actually reacting to a talk with him by the U.S. ambassador, April Glaspie, who was a pretty innocent person. I met her. She didn't know what she was doing. She was relaying a message from Washington, and it was sort of ambiguous. Didn't say it's okay to invade Kuwait, but didn't say don't do it. So Saddam misinterpreted. Within a couple of days, he realized he'd made a mistake when he saw the U.S. reaction. Now, this is August. He began to make offers to withdraw. The U.S. didn't want to hear them. Bush wanted to go in there and smash things up properly. What we say goes. So the offers were disregarded. They kept getting stronger and stronger, disregarded all of them. U.S. media cooperated by suppressing them. It was very interesting what happened. There were constant leaks from the State Department talking about these things. Where did they appeared somewhere in a suburban New York newspaper, New York, Long Island Newsday. Nobody leaks anything to a suburban newspaper. People leak it there because they want it to be seen on the New York newsstands, where you do see this big headline saying Saddam offers to negotiate. Can't miss it. Well, the New York Times has to somehow react to that. So a day later, Thomas Friedman has an article talking about how wonderful the U.S. policy is. It says there are these rumors going around, the 22nd paragraph, that Saddam wants to negotiate, but of course that's nonsense. Let's go on to the next topic. After the war, they finally conceded it. But the idea was, let's smash them up properly We can, of course, easily defeat the Iraqi army, it's a joke. And once we've done that, in a very brutal fashion, in fact, Newsday had some very good reporters, New Royce, a couple others, who reported what was happening. Like U.S. Army was using bulldozers to bury Iraqi soldiers, peasants mostly. The main army was pulled down, so Iraqi conscripts were being buried in the desert by bulldozers. That's the way we were fighting the war. Meanwhile, Bush made sure to really destroy Iraq, destroy the power stations, the infrastructure, a really severe blow. It had nothing to do with rescuing Kuwait. That could have been done by negotiations. Well, that's statesmanship. And it ends up with what we say go. As he put it, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome. What's the Vietnam syndrome? Well, that was addressed by one of the leading neocon intellectuals, Norman Podhoretz. He said the Vietnam syndrome is the sickly inhibitions against the use of military force. We finally kicked that sickly inhibitions against the use of military force. We have the force, let's use it to get what we want, pursue the vile maxim. You go back to Afghanistan. On 9/11, the very day 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld was sending memos, these famous snowflakes, to the defense military saying, can we work this into a way of justifying our broader objectives of attacking Iraq and so on? It's the day of 9/11. They're thinking.
Yeah, that's just, galling. I wanted to kind of shift, because we want to be respectful of your time, and kind of shift more towards what's happening currently in the world. Specifically the rise of China over the last few decades, and now this war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of talk around this, of the emergence of multipolarity, of the end of complete U.S. hegemonic domination of the entire globe. I'm just kind of thinking, what are your thoughts on the emergence of a multipolarity, and what are its implications for U.S. imperialism in the decades to come?
That's a major issue that's developing right now. First of all, the war in Ukraine is going to have a big effect on the emerging world system. There's very little doubt of that. It's already had several effects. One thing is, in his criminal stupidity, Putin handed the United States on a silver platter the greatest gift it could ask for: expanding NATO, driving Europe into the US pocket. It's an amazing contribution to US hegemony. They're just gloating about it in Washington. There's a background here, significant background. Since the Second World War, there has been a question about the role of Europe in world affairs. It's a huge economy, bigger than the United States, more advanced in many ways, certainly in social justice and so on, educationally. Once it got unified through, more or less through the EU, could have been an independent third force, as it was called, in world affairs. Of course, that would require accommodation with Russia, which is part of Europe. That's Charles de Gaulle. He was the leading exponent of what was called Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, maybe even from Lisbon to Vladivostok, an independent grouping which would have no military alliances, or if there were any there, they'd be marginal, but basically a unified, powerful element in world affairs. That was combated by the United States. It's anathema to the United States. The U.S. wanted to impose what's called the Atlanticist system. That means NATO-based, run by the United States. It's now called the rule-based international order, meaning the U.S. sets the rules. as distinct from the UN-based national order, which the US opposes. In fact, it's now almost uniform in US academic and media circles to call for a rule-based international order, while China, the global south, and so on are calling for a UN-based international order. There's a deep reason there. The UN-based international order bars US foreign policy. Can't have that. It bars the threat of use of force in international affairs. Obviously, you can't have that. So we need the rules-based order where we run it. For Europe, that means the Atlanticist version based on NATO. Well, it became a big issue in the early 90s when Russia collapsed, and Gorbachev particularly put forth the idea of a common European home, Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military blocs, co-equal partners, US and Europe, in creating a new world order, which in his view should be social democratic, said mutual transformation in both of the major societies. Actually, George H.W. Bush he didn't like it, but he wasn't strongly opposed to it. It was Clinton who undermined it totally with the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders. It was pretty open and frank about it, actually. But ever since then, this continues. The Russian leaders, including Putin, kept calling for a common European home. The U.S. has been trying to block it. Well, Putin now handed it to the United States. No European common home, Western Europe in Washington's pockets. But there's a problem. China isn't buying it. The global south isn't buying it. They're not participating in the war. No sanctions. Keep their relations with Russia open. They attack the war. They denounce its crime. But then they keep saying, get off your high horse. This is what you do to us all the time. You're in no position to start condemning it. So yes, it's a crime, but we're not going to break ties with Russia any more than we broke ties with you, and you do it 1,000 times worse than Russia does. So the world is dividing up. And a very interesting question is how Europe is going to deal with this. The losers in the war so far, outside of Ukraine, are Germany. Germany had a sophisticated German-based integrated trade and industrial system in Western Europe, stretching from the Netherlands to the former European satellites. That's in real trouble now because it was heavily dependent on exports. It's an export producing area. Most of the exports are to China, and it needed Russian resources, not just oil, but metals and precious metals and others, like nickel, for example, is crucial for all. It's crucial even for renewable energy. They're not going to be able to do much without access to Russia's resources, and they're certainly not going to want to give up their main market in China, main export market, and they're not going to be wanting to be cut out from this huge infrastructure program that China is developing throughout Central Asia, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, an enormous development project, historically unprecedented, also reaches to Africa, even to Latin America. Europe's not going to want to cut out from that. And Russia's right in the way. They can't be part of it unless they accommodate with Russia. So there already are strong pressures, and they're surely going to grow for German-based Europe to ask, do we want to decline hanging on to Washington's coattails, or do we want to move towards a common European home? How that's going to play out Nobody knows, but it's going to be a major factor in world affairs, as will the growing independence of the global South, BRICS, connected with China. Countries like India are playing a very delicate game. Their main military supplier is Russia. They're almost at war with China. They don't like the Russia-China alliance. The United States is trying to draw them into its system for encircling China. They're reluctant. So they're kind of playing both sides in a pretty delicate game. But these are things that are playing out in the world, and they're going to be complicated.
Yeah, and these complexities are very interesting to watch. In some ways, your answer to Brett's question suggests that we have a kind of Cold War, but maybe it'll be a little bit different from the previous Cold War with an Atlanticist vision competing against a kind of Eurasianist sort of vision. But, one of the things that was important in this book in the last chapter talks about the fragility of U.S. power. And that's kind of what we're seeing emerge with multipolar areas of other great powers challenging the U.S. I wondered, does this open up the possibility of more effective challenges to U.S. empire on the one hand, but also does it also make for an unstable and one might say dangerous, even more dangerous world as the U.S. reacts? I feel like in some ways the Iraq War was kind of like the U.S., trying to leverage its military power, in a kind of desperate way to kind of maintain global hegemony. And that since the Second Iraq War, the erosion of U.S. economic and military hegemony has been continuing. Does this open up for very dangerous kind of period, you might say, of aggressive conflict?
It's very dangerous. We don't know how the U.S. is going to respond to this. The United States is historically a very violent power. It's been at war throughout its entire history. Since 1789, there's hardly been a year when the United States wasn't at war, conquering the Indian nations, conquering Mexico, expanding intervention all over, and so on. And as we've talked, that the Godfather doesn't give up easily. Now, we also have to look at the domestic scene. One of the main sources of U.S. weakness is internal. The U.S. is tearing itself to shreds, while the rest of the world is watching, kind of bemused. The United States is an extraordinary outlier. Just take, say, mortality. The United States is the only country where mortality is increasing. That never happens. Mortality constantly declines, except for war or pestilence. But the U.S. is so internally dysfunctional that it's killing itself, literally, among the white, especially white, working class. People are dying from what are called deaths of despair, opioids, suicides, homicides, or militias storming things. We don't know what's going to happen to this country. It may fall apart. In fact, the Republicans are exploiting this and, in fact, inflaming it. It's their basis for power. They can't get votes on their actual programs of enriching the super rich in the corporate sector. So they're mobilizing people on what are called cultural issues. About half of Republican voters now think that the Democrats are grooming children for sexual perversion. About 70% of them think the election was stolen. Same percentage think that Democrats are trying to carry out the great replacement by bringing migrants in to get rid of the white race. It's a level of lunacy that it's really hard to discuss. The you look at the attitudes and beliefs, it's just can't grasp it. But that's very likely going to take over the country. And they're not hiding their proposals. Like Supreme Court, which is by now ultra-reactionary, decided to take up the most outlandish case you can imagine. It's a principle called legislative election interference program or some name like that. It's something that's been hanging around in the woodwork for a long time, which is an idea that state legislatures can intervene to appoint their own electors, no matter what the vote was. For various structural reasons, the state legislatures are mostly reactionary, very heavy effect of the roll vote and so on. So they're majority Republican, very reactionary now. According to this principle, the state legislatures could say, we reject the popular vote and we elect our own right-wing electors. Nobody ever, it has some kind of constitutional basis, but it was so crazy, nobody ever paid any attention to it. Well, the Supreme Court decided, for no reason whatsoever, to take it up. That's Moore v. Harper coming up in the next session of the Supreme Court. Given the nature of the court, wouldn't be a great surprise if they endorse it. That's only one thing. There's another, which was kind of under the radar, but it's now coming up. The last weeks of the Trump presidential era, end of, I think, August or so, 2020, Trump issued an executive order which allows the president to pretty much dismantle the whole civil bureaucracy, civil service, and elect and select loyalists to run it, presidential loyalists. This undermines legislation back to the 19th century to create a neutral civil service. That's the foundation of any democracy. You don't have a neutral civil service, you have a fascist dictatorship. Well, this is what's called Schedule F, was proposed by Trump last days of his tenure in office. Biden rescinded it, but it's an executive order. It's now being debated in Congress. The Democrats in Congress want to pass legislation to block this, even if the court approves of it, legislation which will overrule potential court decision. Republicans are opposed. They want to keep it because they're looking forward to an electoral victory, which will then enable them to establish permanent minority rule by devices such as these. That's where the country's heading, quite apart from its internal dysfunctions, like mortality or a collapsing health system, which is just unbelievable. For example, there's a paper that just came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences studying COVID deaths. In 2020, they estimate that there were more than 200,000 COVID deaths resulting just from the dysfunctional healthcare system. I mean, it's like the country's destroying itself, can't do anything. When Congress wants to pass a bill to rebuild the bridges that are falling apart and the collapsing infrastructure, they have to call it a China competitive bill. Not that we need it, we have to beat China. I mean, the country's going crazy, and it will be very, very interesting. I mean, if you're in Mars and you're just curious, it'll be not living in it. It'll be interesting to see how this kind of collapsing country, with, of course, enormous military force overwhelming everyone, can deal with declining hegemony. That's going to be difficult. And we should not forget that we're meanwhile racing towards climate catastrophe. not only doing nothing about it, but now going backwards. That could be the end of all of us. I mean, that's the world we're living in. And the world I'm living in is I have another appointment to get to. So.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have time. I had one question that I was really dying to ask you about no-fly zones, but if you have to go, you have to go. So that's no issue.
Okay.
I'll ask the question and maybe we'll leave it as a cliffhanger. But this question was essentially a way of allowing the listeners to see their way through how Noam Chomsky thinks through problems, because at surface level, this may seem a little bit contradictory. So, Professor Chomsky, in the past, you've railed against no-fly zones, as of course we on the show have. For example, you did an interview in Truth Out where you said that a no-fly zone in Ukraine could unleash untold violence. Many times where you've said no-fly zones were not justified and completely insane in some cases. But in other cases, you stated in the book that we're talking about, The Withdrawal, that in 1991, it was a good decision to set up a no-fly zone in northern Iraq in the Kurdish area. And that I also had seen in some Turkish media that you recently had signed a letter along with other as distinguished colleagues of yours that a no-fly zone over Rojava would perhaps also be a good idea. So the question of when is a no-fly zone good, when is a no-fly zone not good, if it's the United States that's pushing for the same policy in different instances, like this is at surface level, right? This is at surface level how people might perceive it. So your explanation would be very interesting.
Very straightforward. There's a single principle. What is the policy that would be most beneficial to human needs and human welfare? That's the principle. And in fact, it leads to different conclusions about shallow matters, tactical matters like no-fly zones. So in the case of, say, Rojava in Syria, I wasn't actually calling for a no-fly zone. There was a Turkish invasion, which is already carrying out massive atrocities in Syria against the Kurds, and it would extend to the rest of the Kurdish-run region. And it could have been stopped by simply keeping in place a small U.S. contingent, which has no function whatsoever, doesn't do anything, just deters a Turkish invasion. So that was the right thing to do. In the case of the no-fly zone over northern Iraq, stopped Saddam massacring Kurds. So it was the right thing to do. Case of a no-fly zone in Ukraine, I agree with the Pentagon, which vetoed it for sensible reasons. Because if you set up a no-fly zone in Ukraine, first thing you have to do is attack and destroy Russian anti-aircraft systems, which happen to be within Russia. So you have to start bombing Russia. Then what happens? Well, you're on an escalatory ladder, which will end human life on Earth. So it's not the right idea. So there's no inconsistency. Different tactical decisions have to be made on the basis of a standard elementary moral overriding principle.
Fascinating. Professor Noam Chomsky, unfortunately, we know you have to leave, and we thank you for spending the time with us. It was really fascinating. Now, interestingly, we were planning on having to wrap up now, but we've just been joined by our friend Vijay Prashad. Hello, Vijay. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks.
I have to leave it to Vijay. Take off. It's up to you
nice to see you, Noam.
Everything I just said.
Unlikely.
Good to see you. Good to be with you.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much. So, Vijay, it's nice to have you back on the show. We were hoping to have you with the professor, but this is great.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just came to say hi, really. It's very difficult to be on with Noam, I suppose, but that's not the reason that I was delayed. Still, Noam is the best, person to speak on our book, in fact. So I'm glad you had him on. And I just came to say hi.
Well, it's terrific to be in touch with you, and this was such an interesting work. I mean, and maybe it's in fact actually easier to ask you this questions with Professor Chomsky not present, which is that in some ways this seemed like a real, I mean, it was a history of U.S. empire in, post-Cold War, really starting with the 60s, Vietnam, up to the present and potentially, consequences for the future in this world of multipolarity. But it was also a kind of history of his comments and interventions on these issues as they were happening, his analysis of them, and his reflection of the role of the real responsibility of the intellectual. And so you had these dialogues as a conversation, but it was also, inflected with quotations from previous discussions that he had had and publications that he had had. And so I wondered, what was your thinking with doing this kind of resume, not only of U.S. empire, but also of Professor Chomsky's critique and analysis of it historically over the last 5+ decades?
I've known Noam for, over 30 years, and it's really super difficult to get him to talk about himself, for instance, and to admit that he plays a role in the world, which is extraordinary because, he's a legend. And how could he not be self-aware of that? Of course, he's self-aware of it. But he simply does not like to talk about himself, to insert himself into the story. And in a way, the initial idea for the project was to reflect on Noam Chomsky and the world that we live in, to trace his own radicalization from the US illegal war against the Vietnamese people right up to the present. That was the impetus, I was very interested to come back to his visit to Southeast Asia in 1970. I mean, people don't know about the active work that he has done, the role he has played. It was so significant that he taught in Hanoi during the war. He lectured on a range of issues in Hanoi during the war. And, I know that there's a kind of semi-biography out there and there are other things out there. And I doubt very much that he will allow a biography to be written of him in the classical sense. I very much doubt it. And that has to do a great deal with his integrity and his sense that, world history is made by more than a person. But in a way, Noam Chomsky's political writings are a standing rebuke of US imperialism. And in a way, I wanted to trace that. I mean, you can remember in the parts around the first attack on Iraq, where he reflects on these leaks that came to an obscure newspaper in Long Island, which were not published in the New York Times. Basically what he's saying is, listen, we were telling you all along that these were not correct things. And we were not telling you this, in some abstract way, like, oh, intervention is bad. But in an empirical way, like this intervention is going to be catastrophic in this particular way. And each time when you trace, Noam's writings and a kind of his sort of prophetic way of talking about the world, you find that there is an accuracy to precisely what he is talking about. And I wanted to go back because I bet that there's an entire generation that really has no clue about the fact that Gulf War I, Gulf War II, these things were premeditated disasters, and that there was some marginal, perhaps, but some public discussion about these issues. So, that was the impetus for basically getting him to think. But really, the most powerful part of the book is where it opens, which is when I ask him how he gets the courage to do what he does. And bam, his answer is beautiful. And I'm not going to tell you his answer because that's in the book.
Yeah, the book is absolutely great. And this chance to talk with Chomsky and you about it is also amazing. You're a huge inspiration for me, and I really appreciate all the work that you do, Vijay. And I'm going to kind of ask you a question that I asked Chomsky because I like both of your takes on this. which is, with the emergence of the rise of China over the last few decades, with the war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, a lot of talk about the concept of an emerging multipolarity. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the emergence of this possible multipolarity and what its implications are for U.S. imperialism going forward.
Well, it's always difficult to talk about China in particular because I keep getting attacked for being like an agent of China. These days, if you speak with any sanity, I mean, I'm not pretending to be sane, but if you speak with any sanity, or at least try to approach a rational discussion, you get slammed down, and I'm not just talking about social media. There have been some articles in the South African media recently that have just gone after me viciously, including the fact that I have a non-resident post at a Chinese university, as if that means that then I'm a ventriloquist dummy for Xi Jinping. Maybe I agree with Xi Jinping. Have you considered that maybe I'm in agreement with him, and I don't need to be paid. I don't need to have some sort of, malicious, be a foreign agent or whatever. Maybe I simply agree with some of the things that they're saying. Well, no, it can't be, right? You have to be an agent. So I hesitate, but okay, here we go. I'm actually not of the view that we are moving to a multipolar world. I think things are a little more complicated than that. I believe, for instance, that if you break up power axes into the conventional, distinctions, in terms of military power, there's nobody who can touch the United States. It's just nobody. They have, in a sense, nuclear primacy. Just counting nuclear warheads is wrong. Russians have more nuclear warheads than the US, but the US has much more lethal and better warheads, more accurate warheads, and so on. So nuclear primacy, military power, incomparable. Nobody can compare. They can destroy any country. Political power, it's complicated, and it's been recently weakening. We saw that in the Vladimir Zelensky, lecture to the African Union, where basically only 2 out of 55 heads of governments attended, or the behavior of the Indian government regarding the war in Ukraine, or Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador of Mexico, again, center-left person, but super strong position against US intervention in Latin America. So political power, there's some fragility, and that's why the word fragility is being used in our book. But when it comes to ideological power or information war and so on, it's nobody again to compete with the United States. When it comes to economic power as such, the United States and the dollar still have a hold on world trade, on the questions of development and so on. They still play a pretty overwhelming role, actually. So what I think we are moving towards is a weakening of the perhaps disarticulation of US complete full spectrum power. In bits and pieces, they are weakening their hold on the planet. And I don't think the Chinese or the Russians or anybody are interested in setting up an alternative pole. I think, in my opinion, the Chinese actually don't have the appetite to have a kind of renminbi or yuan dominated world situation. They want to have like a basket of currencies issue, and they want to have a regional issue, and they have a different approach to what's happening. And I feel like we are actually adopting a kind of Eurocentric paradigm. If we go from when it goes from Britain to the United States, and before from Amsterdam to London, and before from the, city-states of Italy to, this Giovanni Arrighi idea of empires go from one center to the other. I actually don't think that the Chinese are interested. They don't want the music to stop. They don't want the parcel in their lap. They don't want the responsibility, quote unquote. They don't want to be the world's hegemon. They say that all the time. There's a kind of Western fascination that China wants to dominate the world, but they are saying we're not interested. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean multipolarity necessarily. It could mean a much more fragmented world system with the United Nations playing a more considerable or respectable role. I don't know, but I certainly know that I don't want us to jump from a kind of unipolar situation. Oh, okay, now we've got a new term, multipolarity. I'm not sure it's that accurate, in fact.
I just want to hop in and add something from the perspective of somebody who's living in Russia. And Vijay, I don't know if you were aware that I'm living in Russia now. I don't think I was here the last time that we talked to one another. But what you describe as
wow, wait a minute. Now I'm the Chinese agent and you're the Russian agent. Good God, man, what's wrong with this podcast? Yes.
Exactly. I wish I was being paid by somebody, but that's not really the case. Otherwise, I wouldn't have my computer set up on some cardboard boxes to prop it up. But that's neither here nor there. What I was going to say, though, is that you're absolutely right that China is not pushing themselves for having a multipolar world. They're not pushing to have themselves propped up. And you can see that very clearly by looking at the media here in Russia. Russia is trying to integrate themselves more tightly with China than, perhaps ever before, at least since the Sino-Soviet split, and this is quite some decades ago. So we're seeing much closer integration these days, and they are successful in some ways. We are seeing a strengthening of the BRICS relationship right now. We're seeing other alternative structures coming together. We're seeing alternatives to SWIFT system being put forth by China and Russia. We're seeing even integration at a smaller level, like credit cards being used. I can tell you from the experience of living here, everybody was either using Visa or MasterCard until this, quote unquote operation started, at which point the domestic Russian card called Mir, which means both peace and world, and Union Pay, the Chinese credit card, became the most widely used things here because of the Western sanctions that were put on Visa and MasterCard. They didn't work for international purchases. You couldn't withdraw money abroad if your card was issued in Russia. Like very, very severe sanctions put on us here. But at every step of the way that we're seeing this happening, the Russian media is like, Russia is pushing for closer integration. Russia is hoping that we will have an alternative to SWIFT very soon. Russia is seeing that with closer integration to China, that we will be moving towards a multipolar world where the United States cannot bully people around. And this is the hope that we keep seeing in every news article that's coming out of here. We're moving towards multipolarity because eventually the integration of Russia and China, and as other countries come into this relationship, through the BRICS alignment or through this alternative to the SWIFT, you're going to have more of a diversity of options within the global market. I hate that term, but you know what I mean. So this is the hope, but yet we see China really dragging its feet into like jumping headfirst into these sorts of arrangements that could legitimately, at least on an economic level, as you mentioned, not on a military level, but on an economic level, really level the playing field on the international stage. So it's very interesting coming from the perspective of somebody who's living here to analyze the news that's coming out here versus the complete lack of the discussion in the West and perhaps some very simplistic takes on it, where, as you mentioned, China is trying to, take the mantle from the United States on the international stage. This just is not true.
Yeah, just to say one thing about that. I mean, there's a reason why China also is refusing to have a military arrangement with Russia. It has a security pact, not a military pact. They're cautious for good reason. They have a large dollar-denominated holding. They continue to export to Western markets. And also, the Chinese do not have a theory that puts them in an imperial position. They don't want that. I mean, this is the thing that's hard to get people to understand. Okay, there used to be a Chinese empire, but that was largely a territorial empire in parts of Asia. Now the Chinese are basically interested in integration into the world. Hello, that used to be called globalization. The irony is that the Chinese seem to be interested in globalization and the West seems to be interested in partitions. Wow.
Well, speaking of these partitions, one feature, it seems, of U.S. strategy now is reaffirming. Of course, we just mentioned NATO's kind of revival and giving it some kind of rationale in the post-Cold War period. And of course, the book deals with much of its extensions beyond, either as securer of the global energy system, i.e. the world, or just frankly just for establishing U.S. hegemony. But in addition to the revival of that kind of military alliance, the U.S. has been involved in something that reminds me very much of practices in the 1950s and 60s during the Cold War, which is creating new regional military alliances. And we've had reports about a new alignment that reminds me of the Baghdad Pact of 1955, with the U.S. trying to sponsor a regional Middle East treaty organization that would now incorporate Israel and, of course, isolate Iran. And we see the AUKUS, kind of formation, which is to hem in China by having the U.S., UK, Australia, and India collaborate. And of course, there is the, collaboration with India, trying to recruit them to oppose China's regional power and its expansion. So this seems to me that we're back in a kind of era of the blocs, and perhaps what you're mentioning about China's different approach to geopolitics reminds me of the Bandung, kind of moment, of the spirit of Bandung, which was, we just don't want to be pressured and forced into a U.S. rules-based military alliance. This, you're either with us or you're against us, attempt at imposing and dictating the terms, not necessarily an aggressive attempt at a new bloc, but that idea that there could be peaceful collaboration among nations of the global South for mutual benefit, for peace, for development. I wonder, and I know you've written about the Bandung, conference in your wonderful book, The Darker Nations. And so I wondered if you have any reflections on that as a way to analyze not multipolarity, but the possibilities of other ways of resisting the U.S. hegemony and reinforcing of it through regional military alliances that are being created.
Yeah, it's a really good point you raised, Adnan. And there's three quick things I'll say, just, observations coming out of what you said. The first thing is, you're right that, in the 1950s, there was the Manila Pact, the Baghdad Pact, and so on. The difference from then and now, and I'm going to structure each of these observations as, yes, it's like that, but then it's different, because, historians and so on.
Right, history changes, yes.
Right. Yes, it was like that. The difference is that in the earlier period, in the 50s, military technology was not as sophisticated as it is today. So, for instance, even though the United States had set up kind of central command, it, of course, is established later. The United States relied on, say, Iran in the 1950s to be a major military partner to help the United States, expand its global reach. Well, now, actually, with its immense base structure and its immense ability to strike targets from the United States. Remember, in Gulf War I as well, U.S. bombers took off in Illinois, flew and bombed Iraq, then landed in Diego Garcia to refuel and flew back to Illinois. And that was not conceivable in the 1950s because they just didn't have the ability to fly a plane filled with weapons and fuel that far. Also, of course, that they can fuel on air, and that technology comes, really sophisticated technology, in the 1970s. With AWACS, you had mobile radar systems and so on. So you need these alliance structures, but also you have the ability to hit any country anywhere in the world. And that's incredible, with ICBMs and so on. So one, yes, it looks similar. You could add in the Quad in Asia. You could add in what you just talked about, the U2, I2, United States, UAE, India, and Israel, this so-called new pact in the Middle East and so on. Yes, it's like that, but not really. Secondly, it's like that and not really, because not really, now many of these countries that are in these kind of alliances, like Australia or the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, find that their largest trading partner or the second largest trading partner is China. So that situation was simply not there in the 1950s, that these countries now have very contradictory problems. Australia's largest trading partner is China, but yet it is in the middle of a security understanding to threaten China. The United Arab Emirates signs a deal so that the Jebel Ali port is basically there to be expanded by the Chinese, and yet it joins this I2, U2 weird formation with India, Israel, and the United States. So that's the second way in which it's not quite, the same. The third way, it's not the same. And now to the other side, the Bandung side, the side of, is there a Bandung-like situation? At our institute, Tricontinental, we joined with the Peace and Justice Project of Jeremy Corbyn and others, and we did a series of articles talking about the new non-alignment. In fact, we'll release that in September in a little booklet. We're looking at this, I think, as you are, is there a new non-alignment emerging? Now, I would say there's a new mood emerging where people are saying, look, we're not interested in this conflict. That's in Africa. That's true in Latin America. That's true in India, as I said. People say, we're not interested in this conflict. I will say to you that as this war in Ukraine accelerates and whatever, people in Germany are going to say, we're not interested in this conflict, okay? We just want power, the price of electricity to come down. We want natural gas from Russia and so on. As it is, many Eastern European countries have been signing new deals with the Russians, saying, okay, we'll pay you, we'll do the trade in rubles and so on. So, the new non-alignment, there's a mood for it. There's something in the air. But I don't see the kind of political confidence available. There's going to be no Bandung conference called by anybody. And this lack of a political confidence is going to hurt the world. Because look at this Nancy Pelosi incident. If she had landed in Taipei, imagine the confrontation. We just don't need this in the world. You've got an ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which the West, let's be frank, okay, the West is basically blocking a peace agreement. It's on the table. It was on the table in the border between Belarus and Russia. And they basically said, no, let's accelerate the conflict to weaken Russia. You have that ongoing. Then if you started something in the South China Straits, the world economy would plunge into something. We don't have a concept for it. Crisis is not sufficient as a term. So there's no mood, who is going to stand up and say, I am going to host a conference on non-alignment, who's going to take that initiative? I just don't see it, Adnan. I don't see Cyril Ramaphosa standing up and saying, everybody come to Pretoria right now. We're going to hold an emergency session of the United Nations, not in New York, but in Pretoria. We're going to assemble the General Assembly or the G77 or the NAM or something is going to happen. They're not doing it. There's just no political confidence.
So you mentioned that, people in Germany would probably be turning against this sort of strategy. And this is something that I cited on a recent episode, maybe one or two episodes back. I used to live in Germany before I lived in Russia, so I still follow a lot of German polls and whatnot that came out of there. And there was a poll that came out at this point, probably about a month ago, where they asked Germans, are the sanctions on Russia hurting Germans more or Russians more or equally? And the results, if I remember correctly, and it's been, like I said, about a month since I've seen it, 47% of Germans said that it's hurting Germans more than Russia. Only 12% of Germans thought that it was actually hurting Russia more. The rest were undecided. This is why we see a widespread apathy towards the situation against the German populace right now, but not by the German political class, especially by people like, Bayerbach, the foreign minister. These are people that do not represent the will of the people, the regular people in the country, which is something that you brought up in the book with Noam Chomsky, where you talk about opposition to the Iraq War. A lot of countries were not signing on to go to the Iraq War, but there was one very interesting case that you talked about of Spain, where nearly every person in Spain, very nearly every person in Spain was very staunchly opposed to the Iraq War, yet the Prime Minister of Spain decided they would join the coalition of the willing, right? So we have some political leaders that completely disregard popular opinion within their country. And it almost always seems that when there is a complete disregard for popular opinion within the country, it is in service of US empire. So I'm curious, Vijay, obviously some of this is because they feel like they're going to get something out of the US, the political leaders are US aligned or something along these lines, but also up until, pretty much the current moment, the United States has its hand so firmly on all of the levers of power, whether it is the SWIFT system, whether it is the international banking systems, whether it is, military means. The United States is a hegemon. Even now it's starting to lose. There's a fracturing of this power, as you mentioned, but up until now, there is this complete power of the United States where a lot of these countries, the political leaders feel like they have to toe the line of the United States. At this point, even though China is not, militarily as strong as the United States, and it's not trying to step up into the forefront, which we've already talked about, there is an alternative now. There is an alternative. So do you think, I mean, you can be brief with this, but do you think that we're going to see less of this sort of egregious going against what the populace of the country wants by country's political classes, when that basically the only reason to do so is to play into the hand of the imperial logic of the United States, now that there's an alternative?
It really depends on the countries and the kind of internal, let's call it, the internal sort of class power of different factions and so on. I mean, we just saw this happen in Argentina, where Alberto Fernandez government had to pay a coupon to international creditors in January of 2022. He traveled to Beijing. He met with people at the People's Bank of China. They opened the window. They said, we'll do a currency swap. You give us pesos, we'll give you renminbi. Then you can take the renminbi to the international markets, buy dollars, pay off your coupon, no problem. And it's not a one-time deal, you can come back. Well, Fernandez goes back, having taken the coupon with him, ready to pay, and they still went to the IMF. And when the letter from the Argentinian finance minister went to the public, in it he said, look, we want to come back to the IMF so that we can return to international capital markets. This has basically been a demand of the Argentinian ruling class. Even though it's a left-of-center government, the finance ministry felt compelled to essentially, honor the demand of the ruling class in Argentina rather than public opinion, and rather than deal with the fact that the IMF would increase austerity on a country that's been battered by austerity for 2.5 decades. So, there's so many examples of this, and it's really about the class power in a country. Does the popular sections have the power to hold a government accountable? We talk a lot about democracy. It's fine, you can have an election and come to power, but will you be held to account? And who will you be held to account by? Are the popular forces strong enough? Having elected somebody, they don't have any command over them. There's no right to recall in most countries, and there's no really structures of accountability. So you can do whatever you want. You're the Spanish prime minister. Public opinion says don't go to war, you sign on to it. Okay, you may lose an election, but the next candidate that comes in is going to hold up the ruling class line. Look at Sri Lanka, massive demonstrations, whatever they may be. Let's not get into whether it's a color revolution or whatever. Rajapaksa gets thrown out of office. The two Rajapakshas, Mahinda goes to a military base. And then who comes in to take over? I mean, of all scandals, it's Ranil Wickremesinghe, who has been off and on Prime Minister of Sri Lanka for 6 times since 1993. He had only one seat. His party had one seat in the parliament of 225. And Wickremesinghe comes in, safe hands for the ruling class. This is another good example of what do you mean by democracy when you talk about the things that are happening in Sri Lanka or in Argentina or other countries. It's not enough to just use the word. What is democracy? We strive, we aspire to democracy, but let's not pretend that these are actually, settled democratic situations. Not at all. And I'm not even mentioning the United States, so leave that aside.
Well, it's very funny that you mentioned that, because that's kind of where I wanted to take the next question. We've been talking about the international arena, imperialism, and certainly that's the focus of the withdrawal. But I am curious about the U.S. domestic situation. It's hard to tell when you're living through it how unique this period of American history is, how uniquely bad it is. So I'm going to kind of ask you that, like, how uniquely chaotic and crisis-racked does this current decade or so in American history seem to you compared to the rest of its history, and where might it go from here? Because, there's a few trajectories that, American domestic society can take from this clear moment of just chaos and crisis and instability. We can move. I mean, we saw SCOTUS do the functionally dismantling core aspects of the administrative state. So you could see something like the end of federalism or even balkanization in the coming decades. The Republicans are clearly going for something like minoritarian rule, which will have to increasingly be backed up by violence, and then we get into fascist dictatorship possibilities. Or there could be, as we've seen throughout American history, more or less a progressive renaissance, working class and progressive politics coming together and pushing back against inequality and all these problems and actually bringing America into a new era of something like prosperity. And what the implications for that will be internationally is unknown. But, maybe I'm missing plenty of possible trajectories as well. So kind of what's your take on how bad things are and where it could possibly go from here?
But Brett, I don't want to repeat what you said. You already said how bad things are and so on. But here's one of the issues is that a significant section of the U.S. ruling class, particularly, say, the tech barons and so on, who contribute a great deal to the political parties, this section of the U.S. ruling class has to, in a way, come to terms with the fact that it no longer is dominant and that it's not going to be able to, just by a miracle, overcome the developments in China. It is a section that's been actually pushing some of the conflict against China. You remember Tim Scott of Apple goes to see Trump during the now seems years ago, the trade war. Tim Scott doesn't say, look, don't do the trade war. Apple produces its stuff in China and so on. Tim Scott said, look, pursue the trade war. We don't mind. We'll take the short-term hit. But in this short term, Samsung is going to benefit. So you should go and tell the South Korean government to somehow have Samsung share some of the pain, the other day, I'm in Santiago in Chile. The other day I was in a shop. I was just scanning the cell phones, it's like 20 Chinese offerings to maybe one or two, made by the US. But of course, it's made by the commodity chain. But the prices are just impossible. You can't beat these Chinese commodities. So the US, that fraction of the US ruling class, from the Tim Scotts to the Elon Musks and so on, they're going to have to come to terms with the fact that they're not going to win, and need to have an accommodation with China. Until that happens, I don't think there's going to be space in the United States for any kind of political rapprochement and so on. And some of these things there will be no rapprochement. I don't actually think you'll go to full-fledged dictatorship. You don't need to. There's no need because this intense, partisanship and paralysis, the inability to move an effective investment expenditure, to have a big investment bill, the whole infrastructure is crumbling, You're unable to actually invest in infrastructure. What are the big achievements of the recent period? The revocation of Roe versus Wade. That's a decisive political breakthrough. Not let's have an infrastructure bill. That was not a decisive political breakthrough. So I don't see any real need for an actual fascist dictatorship. You already have the class power pretty insurmountable. It's not feeling threatened by anything. Why move to a dictatorship? What you will see, and that's why I think this January 6th thing is a little overdone. What you'll see is increased political hooliganism, but not the need for a dictatorship. You'll see more hooliganism of this kind, more outrageous acts of perhaps, direct violence, maybe against minorities of different kinds, maybe more xenophobic violence, maybe against people of Chinese descent or those who resemble people of Chinese descent and so on. But no, liberal democracy has a very dear intimacy with fascistic forms of power. Liberal democracies have no problem with the police going out and shooting people without any accountability. Why would you need to suspend the Constitution to do that? You're already doing it. So I think that when people say, well, we're going to go to fascism, I'm like, wait a minute, fellas, what are you talking about? There's no need for fascism. You've already got power entrenched in the elite, and they are unwilling to accommodate with changes in the world. They're unwilling to have rational conversations with anybody. They're pretty happy having, yelling fights on television, which confuse and disorient people. They're very happy that the left, for instance, in the US, constantly tears itself apart. Now the debate about Xinjiang, how that is, like a earworm enters the world of the left and tears people apart. What's your position on Ukraine? What's your position on this? What's your position on building a united phalanx of Starbucks, Amazon workers with, say, the older unions? What's your position on uniting Black Lives Matter with the trade union movement? Where are those serious discussions? No, it's a litmus test. If you don't agree with me on Ukraine, then you're, excommunicated or whatever. This is where the discussion should be, not escalating to fascism. There was a book written many years ago, published by the now out of, closed down South End Press, called Friendly Fascism, which is about the argument made then. It's a little bit like Upton Sinclair. When fascism comes to the United States, it will arrive in a friendly fashion. And I think the author was reflecting on kind of the Reaganist dynamic. I quite agree. You don't need the jackboots and the this and the that. Those people are a curious anachronism, and they will provide the hooligan function, which is probably necessary in some spaces and places. But by and large, why do you need idiots in jackboots when you've got a police force that is given license to just walk out on the street and shoot anybody they want? And there's so little, accountability for that, almost zero, right? So, there are real debates to be had. And I'm afraid those debates don't seem to me to be happening. Like I look at the discussion around the Starbucks workers or the Trader Joe's workers or the Amazon workers. People celebrate these isolated victories, but then there's no question of what's the historical block that could be created out of these developments, linked to the older unions, linked to Black Lives Matter, linked to, the millions of people who are angry with the revocation of Roe versus Wade. Can there be a historical block that is not electoral be created out of this? Because the moment you start thinking electoral, then the energy is dissipated to the mainstream of the Democratic Party. That's the end of that. But think in Gramscian terms of a historical block rather than an electoral formation. The debate, how it always gets to, right? Isn't it tiring? Can there be a third party? Let's not have an electoral debate. Let's have a debate about politics, about the historical block. How do you constitute that? Wow, but it's not happening right now. I hope that you guys engineer more and more discussions like that. Bring in trade union leaders, bring in Black Lives Matter leaders, have them talk to each other as well. Talk about the possibility of creating a political bloc, because even they have a limited horizon. They suddenly think about the next election. And is there a way to get people to start talking about something different?
Well, Vijay, I want to be respectful of your time. I know that you said that you were just coming in to say hi, so we stole a little bit of your time, but that's okay. Can you tell the listeners how they can find you as I read us out of this interview section of the episode?
Well, I would like to say that people should go and read The Withdrawal, not because I had anything to do with it, but because it's really a kind of way of understanding the arc of Noam Chomsky's thinking. But people are happy, I'm happy to have people come and look at the tricontinental.org, the website, and look at the material we produced. But hey, I came to say hi, and this is a very long hi and perhaps a even longer goodbye.
Yeah, that's okay. And I highly recommend everybody check out the Tricontinental's newsletter. I get it in my inbox every week, and just read the last one yesterday or the day before. And as always, excellent. So thank you for that resource, Vijay. Listeners, you definitely need to pick up The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. It's available from the New Press, and it'll be coming out right when this episode comes out. So on that note, we will be right back with the wrap up. And listeners, we're back with a wrap up. We just finished our interview, kind of an interlocking interview with Professor Noam Chomsky and Vijay Prashad. We thought that we were going to have them together, but it turns out that we had them sequentially. But regardless, it was a fascinating conversation with a lot of different topics that were covered and based around this really interesting book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. And I will pitch one more time that you should pick up this book. It'll be coming out right when the episode does. If you listen to Guerilla History, and guess what? If you hear this part of the show, you obviously do, you'll like The Withdrawal. It's written as an interview between Vijay and Noam. And so it's like reading a podcast. It's really excellent. So if you like how these kind of conversations unfold over time, this is exactly how the book unfolds. It'll definitely be up your alley. Brett, why don't I toss you the initial thoughts from this interview that we had with Professor Chomsky and Vijay?
Yeah, first off, it actually kind of worked out very well. It was almost like more difficult to have them both on at the same time. So to have that perfect sequential, Vijay comes in right when Chomsky's leaving, it actually worked out very nice. But I just, to start off the outro remarks, I'm just infinitely impressed by, given Chomsky's age, I think he's 93 years old at this point, just how absolutely coherent he is, how his working memory is better than mine at my best day, and his crystallized intelligence, this library of almost a century of deep intellectual knowledge, is just pulled from at will. I'll never not be impressed by that. He's 15 years older than Joe Biden. So for what it's worth, it's just that. But then, yeah, just generally, this is my once a lifetime opportunity to speak with Chomsky in person and actually ask questions. And it was absolutely a real gift for me and something that I won't be forgetting anytime soon.
Definitely will treasure it. Not only because it was with somebody we've revered, we've read, we've learned from so much, but also because he's an inspiration even to this day, with his acute analysis. And as you were pointing out, Brett, the acuity that he maintains. I mean, he is a sharp guy who not only can analyze what's going on, but in the present, but connect it with this wealth of engagement that he's had. And that's why the book is also so fascinating. As I mentioned in our conversation with Vijay, that one thing that was so interesting about it was the way in which they incorporated quotations from Chomsky's work on the subjects that we're looking back on retrospectively now to see how U.S. empire has functioned. And so it gives you a really nice resume also of his career and his critique of U.S. empire and his exemplification, as he's doing still today, of the responsibility of the intellectual, which is to really speak truth to power and to analyze with a critical acumen, honestly, beyond the propaganda, beyond the manufacturing of consent, to actually analyze, the way in which U.S. power is operating around the world and its devastating consequences, to have the courage to do that. So that's wonderful. And then on top of it, to have a chance to reflect a little bit on it and on the book with Vijay, as well as hear about his analysis of the situation presently and the future. Fascinating. I think what he's really done in his last remarks with us is set, I think, what is the clear agenda for the left is, and something that we've talked about many times in different ways, but it really crystallized it. It's like, well, when are we going to talk about the possible political formations that we need to forge now that, revive, as you were saying, Brett, other eras of progressive left action, whether it was, populist farmers, in the Middle West in the late 19th century, whether it was progressives trying to roll back the, golden age, feudal industrial barons of the United States control over everything to try and create a little bit more equality, whether it was struggles for women's rights and the franchise or against racial injustice. At certain periods, there have been opportunities for solidarity and forging a kind of political coalition. That's what we need to be doing now, and figuring out how we can enlist the kind of labor resistance, into a kind of more broader based political movement against the kind of oppressive class politics that is camouflaged behind various forms of ideology that are isolating and polarizing people to really recognize the genuine material interests and also just the urgency of this couldn't be more clear, and it's something that Professor Chomsky ended with, which is that we're going to kill ourselves if we don't do something about the climate emergency. That is a huge challenge we're facing. It's a global challenge, and instead of coming together to create the foundations for a collective solution to save our planet, to save human life and animal life and plant life on this planet, we're accelerating the drive toward it in this kind of short-term fashion, and the forces that have to come together to stop it are actually pitted against one another, divided, and that's very destructive. So I think this was a very important conversation on multiple levels, not only about the book and its key themes, but about the urgency of moving beyond the fragmentation that imperialism is creating around the world and dividing people from their common collective interests.
And I agree with everything that's been said. And what I want to add in is that there's genuinely so much to learn from both Professor Chomsky and Vijay. And I say that as somebody who doesn't have ideological alignment with Chomsky in many ways. Obviously, broadly speaking, we're both, on the pretty far left. So in that regard, we are ideologically aligned. But, he's described himself variously as an anarcho-syndicalist or a libertarian socialist. And as the listeners probably know by now, I'm more of the Marxist-Leninist type with a lot of dependency theory thought and a lot of, Black liberation thought, Walter Rodney, Nkrumah, some of these things sprinkled in there. So not a ton of ideological alignment once you dig into the left tendencies themselves. But Noam Chomsky is a wealth of knowledge. I mean, every time that you listen to him, every time that you read him, you see the total acuity of thought. You see the complexity of thought, the ability to tie in all of these various threads. And regardless of whether or not you have the same ideological tendency as him or not, you're going to learn so much. And the same goes for Vijay. Vijay doesn't have based on my perception, Vijay doesn't have ideological alignment with Chomsky either. I'd say that, Vijay is much more closely aligned to me, but also, there are differences here as well. But yet they've been writing together, working together, corresponding with one another for 30 years, which is the epilogue of the book. Vijay writing about his correspondence with Chomsky over 30 years. By having these sorts of relationships with people that have a deep acuity and understanding and complexity of thinking about the world, events that are happening, historical phenomena, geopolitical phenomena, by really taking what we can from those thoughts and fostering these sorts of relationships with one another, even if we don't, necessarily agree on every single thing, that is how we can arrive at many of the same decisions, many of the same conclusions. This is how we can advance our own thought in many ways, be challenged. So I think that, these sorts of works that have people of somewhat differing ideologies, and whether or not they differ from you, consuming these works is really important. And it's something that I hope that we talk about in an intelligence briefing sometime is, reading outside of your specific ideology. The reason I bring this up is that, I know some of the people that listen to the show are going to say things like, you had Noam Chomsky on, he's an anarchist, which, he's not an anarchist, but that'll be the charge level. How could you bring an anarchist on? I'm a Maoist. There's no way I would ever listen to this. Or you have Vijay Prashad on. He talks about, Xinjiang, and he's dismissing the U.S. government's claims because he's a tanky, and you're bringing tankies onto the show. These are the sorts of allegations that are inherently going to be brought up. But both Vijay and Noam are deeply, brilliant individuals with so many insights that we can glean from them. And the opportunity to have them both on for an interlocking conversation and have this book, along with their other works where they've collaborated on before, to have them synthesize their differing ideologies on complex topics is really invaluable. And I'm very grateful that we had the opportunity to bring that onto the show. And I think that the show is only the better for that. Guys, any final words as we wrap up? Brett, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, in extreme diplomatic language, if anybody is you shouldn't have had on Chomsky or Vijay because I disagree with, just fuck off. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and regardless of whether you agree with him on everything or not, he is a absolutely fundamental public intellectual for American history. And this book I'm holding right now, you can't see it for most people listening, but my co-host can. Profit Over People by Noam Chomsky, Neoliberalism and the Global Order, is a book I came across, I think, 18 or 19. And I was not politically sophisticated whatsoever. Even now you can see from, I think, almost 15 years ago, it's heavily highlighted. I felt my worldview shift reading this book at age 19. And so, I can never toss somebody aside for having that impact on my political development. And, one thing is, when Chomsky inevitably passes, I think there will be some people on the Marxist side of things, especially online, that circus that is social media, that will be more or less dancing on his grave or using that moment to take sectarian shots at the guy. And I disdain that entire approach to politics. I view Chomsky as an elder, for the American left to learn from, not, 19-year-olds who just became Marxist yesterday talking about how Chomsky's an anarchist and he's not, one of us or whatever. I think all that is very, very silly. And it's precisely the type of attitude that Vijay was warning against and that makes the left so weak, so inefficient. Because it's the tyranny of differences that aren't even perceivable by most human beings, but it's going to be the thing that drives you to disown this person or to not work with that group or whatever it may be. So just humble yourself. And one thing we can learn from Chomsky is his deep and profound humility. And Vijay pointed to this. It's like he doesn't ever make it about himself. He never will even, indulge in you trying to ask questions about himself because it's not about himself. And that displacement of his own ego and focus on the work and the educational work is something that no matter what you believe, you can absolutely learn from. And his deep humility, his deep ability to learn and pull from that store of knowledge, and his just fundamental role in educating a lot of people like me on U.S. empire. These are crucial contributions, and he should be absolutely saluted for it. And I just also wanted to say on some of the political points he made really quickly, just on one that stood out that I wrote on my notes is, he's talking about Bush and Afghanistan and, smashing it up and like American anger being taken out on the Afghan people. And just worth remembering that when Obama came in, Obama's big thing is like the Iraq war is bad, but Afghanistan is our just war. This is where we actually are, justified in doing this. And, Chomsky just tears that to shreds. And I think he does a wonderful service in that and in so many other areas as well. So that's my thought, my personal thought on that issue in particular.
Yeah. Adnan, any final words as we wrap up this episode?
No, just that I think this is a wonderful conversation. We can all learn something from it. So let's focus on the real work, not the asserting ourselves in identity fashion. The real identity is we're human beings who want justice and equality in this world. We've got a lot of work to do. So let's focus on the real work and the political education that we need. And we'll have differences, but that political education, I think, was fully and thoroughly advanced today in discussing the key issues of U.S. empire and of the world to come. The only thing I really wish we could have talked a little bit more about, but I think Vijay started getting us on that, is what's our role in this going forward? What is the responsibility of intellectuals in the next stage? Because it may differ. There will be different opportunities and responsibilities. How can we make a difference? In the unclear and contested global future ahead. The main thing, however, is that we just have to be committed and continue that commitment to the ideals of solidarity, of equality and justice. I mean, that's our guiding principle. And I feel those principles fully reinforced after a great conversation with two luminaries of the left.
Totally. I think that's a great note to end us on. I'll just say that, as we wrap up this episode, you've finished listening to the episode, share this episode on social media, and then log off. Go organize in the real world. Do some activism in the real world. Do some political education in the real world. As Brett said, a lot of these worst, tendencies within the ideological left sphere of things is, I don't want to highlight young people, but people that are terminally online that have just come into an ideology and they decide that they have to be loud online. Share this episode online somewhere and then log off. Go outside, talk to some people, share some stories, teach a thing or two, learn a thing or two, and then organize. Brett, how can our listeners find you and all of the excellent work that you do?
Well, thank you very much. You can find everything I do at revolutionaryleftradio.com. I don't promote as much on Twitter anymore. I mean, for the last several months, specifically with Rev Left and even Red Menace, I just find the diminishing returns on that. So if you just follow us on Twitter, it might be best to subscribe to the show on actual podcast app or go to the website itself to really keep up with what we're doing. But I've released a lot of new Rev Left stuff. We just dropped a Red Menace episode I'm very proud of, and a lot more is coming, so stay tuned.
Yeah, totally. Lots of really great stuff has come out within the last week. I think you've put out 3 episodes within the last week or so. I really Excellent. Adnan, how can the listeners find you and your other podcast?
You can follow me on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein, Husain. And if you're interested in Middle East, Islamic world, we've had some infrequency over the summer and with travels, but the Majlis will be back this coming month. So look forward to an episode, in particular, a conversation with my former PhD student, Muhammad Abdu, and his exciting book, Islam and Anarchism. And so look for that conversation. You can subscribe to the Majlis, Majlis, on all the platforms.
Yeah, really looking forward to that conversation. I have a funny story about that, but I think I've told it twice before during these wrap-up segments, so I'll save it for some other time. Maybe you can bring it up on the Majlis. But anyway, as for me, listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. My wife and I have another little show that we do basically for fun, but we have some very interesting conversations on there. I know we'll be talking with Harriet Fraud sometime very soon, as well as some other people. Max Haven, author of Palm Oil, Fuel of Empire, Grease of Empire, sorry. So very interesting conversations coming up. You can find that on any podcast app or on YouTube by going to What the Huck ? Or just look on my Twitter page, you'll find it. And what I really want to do is encourage people who are still listening to this episode at this very, late stage of it to subscribe to the new Guerilla History newsletter. Every week we're putting out a newsletter. It comes out every Saturday. It's got a roundup of all of the latest things that Brett, Adnan, and myself have put out, as well as reading, listening, viewing recommendations by us, the hosts of the show, as well as former guests of the show. People like Amanda Yee from Radio Free Amanda have been submitting things. Richard Wolff has submitted things. Salvatore Angel de Mauro, Brandon Wolf Honeycutt, people that you know and love from past episodes of Guerilla History. These are the people who are telling you things that you should keep your eye out for, things that are worth reading, things that are worth watching, listening to. And you can find that just by, if you Google Guerilla History, Guerrilla History newsletter. I believe it's guerillahistory.substack.com, something like that. Totally free. It's just a weekly piece of, it's a resource for political education is really what it is. And I would like as many people to check it out and share it as possible. Totally free. As for the show, you can follow the show on Twitter at Guerilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. And you can support us and help us keep the lights on to continue doing conversations like this by going to patreon.com/Guerilla History. Again, GUERRILLA. Until next time, listeners, solidarity.